Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Conversations with History. In this episode, we will cover Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. And it'll be a quick recap of Reconstruction, and then we will dive into the politics, economics, and society of the Gilded Age. I am once again joined by my astute colleague, Mr. Corey Blevins.
Can you believe I'm back?
I can't.
I can't.
After the last 8 episodes.
I can't believe it. And I'm going to say right now, we're gonna do a quick recap of Reconstruction. What Mr. Pierce and I need is someone to hold a gun to us and say, make it quick.
Right. Of course, episode 8 in the previous course was all about Reconstruction, and
What an episode.
we're going to try to kind of recap that and get through it without
Rambling.
without trying to reinvent the wheel. So very quickly, phases of Reconstruction. We know that Lincoln had his 10% plan, where 10% of Southern former Confederate states, their population could take an oath. If they were loyal to the Union, they could be readmitted into the Union. And of course, there's a debate about whether they were ever out of the Union,
Right.
Whether they were still in the Union and they were just being run by traitorous governments. Andrew Johnson, after the assassination of Lincoln, he thinks it's his job to carry out this really quick and charitable readmittance into the Union for these Southern states, as Lincoln said in his second inaugural, with malice towards none and charity for all.
Right.
That was his idea of readmitting these states, and not necessarily a reconstruction of the Union.
No. For Andrew Johnson, you get a sense with Andrew Johnson, it's kind of a back to normal, right? Slavery is over, right? And you can't go back from that. But the race relationships in the Old South, Andrew Johnson's kind of want to get back to normal. And for Andrew Johnson, back to normal, and I'm using air quotes around normal.
Air quotes.
Yeah, back to normal did not include Black Southerners whatsoever. In terms of, they were, in Andrew Johnson's plan, they were not going to be involved in politics at all.
Right. And so we see him issue thousands of pardons to white Southern elites who were part of the Confederate Army.
Right.
And part of Reconstruction was, part of the deal was that if you were over a certain rank in the Confederate Army, I believe it ended at major was the rank, where if you were above that rank, a general officer, a colonel or a brigadier or even a full general, you were not going to be allowed to participate in the governments of those reformed Southern states.
Right.
And very quickly, all those men who were not supposed to be allowed to take part in the government were running the governments of those states. By 1867, they had, in a whirlwind, they had elected all of these former Confederate supporters and soldiers. They had rewritten their constitutions, and they had effectively left out African Americans completely. And the only things that they had said in their constitutions about African Americans were that they were effectively going to be in a state of quasi-slavery again. They were free, but not really.
Not in any way that the formerly enslaved wanted to be free. And for Andrew Johnson, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, this guy, chump, he was the vice president of the Confederate government. He is immediately going to turn around and be a senator from Georgia, I believe.
Yes.
Georgia. And for Andrew Johnson, he's got no problem with that, right? His issue is really not with these people. Again, he wants to get back to normal. And for him, normal means allowing these people to hold power in a similar way that they once did.
Right. And so this lasts for 2 years. Andrew Johnson is just plagued by his inability to coexist with the Congress, with the radical Republicans in Congress. And of course, they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which bars the president from removing and replacing cabinet members and members of government bureaucracies. So for instance, the Secretary of War couldn't just be replaced if he was a radical Republican. And that Tenure of Office Act will go for a while. They end up not renewing it in about 10 or 15 years' time, but he will be impeached.
Yeah.
Andrew Johnson will be impeached under the Tenure of Office Act because he just says, I'm not going to abide by this congressionally passed law. I'm going to replace these people with who I see fit. And he's impeached. Now, of course, he's not removed,
No.
but his impeachment was the end of his effectiveness as president.
He was the hatred between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans was unbelievable. Andrew Johnson went so far as to accuse a radical Republican of conspiring to kill Abraham Lincoln.
Mhm.
So there was just a ton of hatred and dislike between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans. But it wasn't just a personal dislike. It involved ideas about how the nation should be reconstructed.
Right.
Andrew Johnson kind of back to normal. The radical Republicans saying, no, we're not going back to normal. We're
No.
truly going to have a reconstruction.
Right.
We're going to rebuild the South in every way that we can.
Right.
That's a huge difference of opinion.
And this radical Republican ideology that we've talked about before of free soil, free labor, free men,
Mhm.
The idea that this Yankee, and I use that as an affectionate term, this Yankee work ethic and
Right.
ingenuity, and is going to come into the South and just break up the old, what was considered kind of
Oligarchy.
lazy bureaucratic oligarchy of the South, and this landed elite was going to be dissolved,
Right.
and there was going to be this new ingenuity in the South, this rebirth of industry in the South.
Right.
And by industry, I don't necessarily mean factories. I mean just the will to work that the Northerners and Republicans believed that the South was incapable of.
Right.
And they believed that part of that was due to slavery, that slavery had innervated the white population of the South and the black population of the South, and that over the years it had caused the South to be unindustrious and really to fall behind, and they were going to replace that.
And some of the most radical Republicans are going to go so far as to say that the land of white Southern elites, particularly the ones who favor the Confederacy, would be broken up and given to black Southerners so that they could be independent farmers. Now, a plan like that wouldn't actually happen, but that's when we talk about radical Republicans, some of them were truly radical
Right.
in a very unique way in U.S. history.
And of course, I think personally, in reading the history of Reconstruction, if you read Eric Foner or Kenneth Stamp, both of them agree, 40 years apart, but they agree that land reform was possibly the greatest failure of Reconstruction, that the inability of black freed slave farmers
Mhm.
to gain land and to work on their own property rather than for the same men that they were enslaved to before was really the ultimate nail in the coffin of this idea of a reconstructed South, because as long as the land and the property still belonged to the original slaveholders, they didn't have the freed slaves didn't have the political or the economic power
That they
to
should've.
really overturn that old society.
And Reconstruction represents that opportunity to do that. I mean, that's radical reform. The opportunity to do that was right there. And an opportunity like that had never come before. And that opportunity would expire without it happening.
Right. So in 1876, Congress passes quite a few acts that allow them to create military governorships and military districts in the South. And they say, okay, look, presidential reconstruction's over. Andrew
Yep.
Johnson is not in charge anymore. He's the president, but he's not in charge anymore.
Yeah.
And we're going to institute radical reconstruction on the basis of you will reconstitute your states. You will write new constitutions. You will have new elections where African Americans will be able to vote. We will institute the Freedmen's Bureau in the South to help freed slaves with education, with land, starting farms, things like that. And that was done at the end of a sword.
Yeah.
It was done by taking troops into the South and saying, look, there's a garrison of Union troops in your town.
Yep.
Let black people vote, or
Right.
the alternative.
It's the power of the federal government. The power of the federal
Right.
government during Reconstruction, for at least a few years during Reconstruction, will be used to protect the equality of Southerners.
Mhm.
And Andrew Johnson and people like him are going to go insane over this.
Mhm.
But for Andrew Johnson, it really doesn't matter because the radical Republicans have such a huge majority in Congress. Andrew Johnson is going to veto all this. Doesn't matter. They
Right.
override his vetoes. So the radical Republicans have full control of the federal government for a few years.
And you see, I think for a lot of these people, we'll talk about how they're not as galvanized later on, but at the end of the Civil War, the first few years of Reconstruction, we'll say the first 5 years, there's this strong feeling, and you see this in Thaddeus Stevens' speech that you'll read during this module. he said, we haven't achieved the victory yet.
Right.
The victory was not at Appomattox. The victory will be when freed slaves own property and can vote, and we have true equality in the South, and that we transform the South from this old backward society that it was to this new, industrious society where Black people are equals. That was the victory for them. The victory had not yet been achieved.
Right.
So in many ways, they're still fighting the Civil War.
Yeah, and they said that much. That's how they. Yeah, you're exactly right. That's how they viewed it. And again, the opportunity was right there. Right, there were some of these radical Republicans who were willing to take those steps. What happened? It would not happen.
Right. Simply did not have the will to do it.
Yep.
So at the end of, before the end of Reconstruction, we do get 3 huge amendments to the Constitution. We'll quickly go over these. We've gone over them before. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment extends equal protection of the law, of federal laws to citizens of all states. And the 15th Amendment gives freed slaves, male freed slaves, the right to vote. And I've often heard this kind of in a logical path of you need freedom, then you need protection of the law, and then once you have freedom and protection of the law, you can participate in government. And that these kind of come in that logical progression.
And these are the 14th and the 15th Amendment in particular are very much radical Republican ideas put into practice. In Congress, the radical Republicans had passed laws already to provide for some of the same things that the 14th and 15th Amendment will do, but radical Republicans want to go a step farther. They just don't want them to be federal laws. They want them put in the Constitution itself to be much more strengthened, to be much more secure.
Right.
So they can truly enforce kind of what they hope in these amendments.
And when we talk about civil rights, we think about the 50s and 60s, but
it's here.
These are the first civil rights acts. And also, under the Grant administration in the 1870s, they passed civil rights acts. Some of them to strengthen voting rights.
Right.
Others really to curb the KKK, the original KKK,
Right.
and the white supremacist groups in the South. Of course, we'll see kind of a death of the KKK, or at least a hibernation of the KKK throughout the Gilded Age after the civil rights acts of the 1870s and the end of Reconstruction, and then we'll see them come back into play in a big way in the 1920s.
We can't get rid of those people.
No.
We can't do it.
No,
They're always around.
They couldn't get rid of them.
Yep.
They just packed away their regalia and waited till
For another
the
day.
time was right.
Yeah.
That is legitimately what happened when the government started to flex its muscles and say, look, we're gonna treat you like basically terrorists.
Yeah.
Which is what they were.
Exactly.
Then they saw the writing on the wall and they said, okay, we need to end Reconstruction. Once Reconstruction was ended, they didn't have to wear a hood on their head.
They could run for office
to be in control through violence. They had political control again.
Yes.
So the KKK was really no longer necessary because you didn't have to put on a hood and burn down someone's house. You just had to run for office, get elected, and then make a law that said they couldn't vote.
Right. Which is exactly what happened.
Right. So the end of Reconstruction. Very quickly, I want to cover this. Scalawags and carpetbaggers. A scalawag was someone from the South, especially someone who had fought in the Civil War for the South. The arch scalawag being James Longstreet, who was, the heartbeat of the Confederacy. After Stonewall Jackson's death, he was looked on as a hero by his men, and this real sense that these men had in the Civil War of they were very deeply invested in their commanders. Yeah. And these men were proud to have served under men like Longstreet, right? Regardless of their politics, regardless of, just in the sense of comradeship that they felt for Longstreet. Right. They felt like him, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Braxton Bragg, these men, they felt almost like a paternal love for these men, that they were there. They were kind of like a father figure to them. And so when men like James Longstreet become Republicans, right, and start to accept Reconstruction and fight for it, he is considered a scalawag, a bad guy. Yeah. He's evil now, right? And that's hard for these men to take. It was hard for them to see someone that had led them into battle now just throw that out the window and really embrace Reconstruction.
They're seen as race traitors,
right?
Too, like right now. Whereas before they were kind of fighting in a certain way for the white race, now they're working for equality for Black Southerners. That is a fact that those white Southerners had an extreme reaction against.
Right. And a carpetbagger is someone who's also working for Reconstruction
True.
in a Republican capacity, but they were Northerners who immigrated to the South after the war. And most of them really did come for because they had government positions where that forced them to come to the South. They
Sure.
were military governors or military officials, or they saw, there were tons of Union soldiers who marched through the South in a time of war, but they came from places like New York City.
Yeah.
They came from places like Philadelphia, and they arrived in an unspoilt Georgia or an unspoilt landscape of Louisiana or Mississippi, and they were like, "This is beautiful. There's so much potential here. Look at these rivers. Look at this land. Look at what we could produce if we moved here." And a lot of them did come for economic reasons,
Sure.
but Southerners saw them as exploiters of the South. They didn't come there to be Southerners.
They're outsiders.
They were outsiders. They could never be Southerners. It didn't matter how long you lived in Mississippi. If you were from Indiana or you were from Illinois, you were never going to be a Southerner, and you were seen as an exploiter of the South. No matter how much you were connected to it didn't matter. You went to the same church, your family intermarried with Southern families. You were never going to be one of them. And your kids probably never were going to be one of them either. So this real distrust and hate of people who were coming to the South or who had lived in the South that were in favor of Reconstruction kind of made it impossible for Reconstruction to be successful on a societal level, because the society of the South was never going to accept it.
No.
And then, of course, the Republican Party starts to realize that their bayonet rule or rule at the end of a sword in the South is seen as oppressive, even in the North. And people are just getting tired of it. It becomes a worn out talking point of we need to finish the Civil War. And by 1875, they don't have the will to stop the Mississippi Plan. So what was the Mississippi Plan?
The Mississippi Plan is going to be copied in other southern states, but essentially white supremacists in Mississippi and in other southern states too are going to use violence of the KKK, but it's not just KKK. There's a lot of white supremacist groups, and they're going to use violence to keep Black people from voting. Black voting is, in a lot of ways, the key issue here, right? And so if the KKK and other groups like that can use violence and terror and the threat of violence to keep Black Southerners from voting, then, of course, white Southerners are the only group really left to vote. And so they can claim power in these state governments. And, of course, once white supremacists take power in Mississippi and South Carolina, wherever, of course, they're going to make laws that benefit them and that keep Black people from voting, that deny them some of the rights and progress they had gained during Reconstruction, during just a few years earlier. And so the Mississippi Plan is essentially white supremacists taking control of the Mississippi government and excluding Black Mississippians from participation in that government. And again, it's Mississippi, it's South Carolina. It's going to be pretty much all of them over time.
And so in 1876, the Republicans see that they're going to lose the White House. And they're going to begin to lose in Congress as well, because the Democrats have put up a Northern Democrat, Samuel Tilden from New York, an industrialist, very much in favor of free trade. And he's on an economic platform. They make it they're very subtle in the way that they shift the focus from we're fighting to end Reconstruction, we're fighting to keep Black people from having rights, we're fighting for a white man's society in the South too. We want economic prosperity for the country. You know who doesn't want economic prosperity for the country? Those nasty Republicans, because all they care about is whether Black people get to vote or not. And that played very, very well in the North.
And it was very much a viciously racist campaign. And one thing we got to keep in mind is that white supremacy was not just a white Southern thing at all. Ideas of white supremacy were very common among the white Northern voting population.
And it was it crossed caste systems. So it was the white Northern working man felt the danger of the Black labor force. And the white Northern elite just felt superior. And there was, you were not going to meet somebody in New York. And even before the Civil War, as we talked about before, Western New York was very democratic. And they were not necessarily opposed to slavery. They definitely believed that white people were superior to Black people. And they were very heavily democratic, right? The barn burner Democrats in Western New York. So it wasn't like the Democratic Party just ceased to exist in the North. And after people got tired of Reconstruction, the Democratic Party sees a resurgence in the North. And in the election of 1876, we see that Republicans make a deal with Democrats. They say, look, we will retain the White House, but we will end military rule in the South. And when the garrisons that had protected the black vote in the South are removed, Reconstruction ends because white supremacists take control of those governments, and black rights are pushed to the side, and they never really recover until after the Civil Rights Movement.
Well, for white supremacists like those making the Mississippi Plan, for any white supremacists in the South, after Reconstruction is ending and they're at the end of Reconstruction, who's going to stop them from keeping black people from voting? No one is. It was the federal government doing that in 1867. Those kind of early years, or those maybe middle years of Reconstruction. But now at the end, there's nobody to stop them, and nobody does.
Right, and those people who had been champions of those African American rights are either dead, they've died,
dead,
or they have moved on to what they see as more important political issues. That this is a losing political issue, and we can't continue to win on this issue. Right.
Yep. Exactly.
So after Reconstruction's over, what we're going to get is this idea of the quote unquote New South, and this New South idea is presented by Henry Grady.
It's a bit of a media campaign.
It is a media campaign by Henry Grady, and it's based on 3 specific points. Acceptance of the end of slavery. He says he's talking to Northern crowds. He's talking to Northern people, trying to tell them what they're doing in the South. And he says everyone in the South agrees that slavery is over, and there's no chance of the plantation system ever coming back.
Right.
I don't necessarily believe that's true. I think most people in the South were still incredibly bitter about the end of slavery.
Yes.
But a big part of this was him saying we've moved on from that old backwardness.
Right.
This backwardness of a slave society is over now.
Come invest in southern cities.
Come invest.
We're different now.
Right. We're looking forward to the second thing, which is urbanization and industrialization.
Yes.
We're going to have factories. We're going to have all the things that make the North and the Midwest so powerful. We're going to have those things in the South. And not only that, but in the 1870s and through to the end of the Gilded Age, in the New South, production of everything was up. Cotton production goes through the roof. Production of steel through the roof.
Yep.
Birmingham, Alabama becomes the steel city of the South. I have to mention this. Fans of college football will know that Alabama and Auburn used to play their game every year in the Iron Bowl. And it's still called the Iron Bowl, even though they don't play it in Birmingham anymore. Sure. But it's still called the Iron Bowl because Birmingham was built as this New South city that was it was the Pittsburgh of the South. Yep. Right. And then the final thing,
bit of a caveat to all this new South talk.
All that sounds great. We're accepting the end of slavery and urbanization, industrialization. We're going to have cities and factories and all this. We're going to come out of this backwardness, except.
But before who? Who are these things for?
These are for white people.
Right. Yes.
Henry Grady is very clear in Northern crowds, and it plays well to Northern crowds because they feel the same way about their government.
That's true.
They feel like the federal government is a government of white people and not black people, and the general common man in the North, in New York, in Connecticut, in Illinois and Louisiana and Ohio, they feel like that's true. They want a white man's government.
Yep.
So after Reconstruction is over, we have this New South plan, and the black codes and Jim Crow become prevalent in
extremely common.
The South.
Yeah, and that really is the crux of it, because the New South is again billed as this modern South, this place to come, this place to invest, but all of that is kind of piggybacked on the suppression of black rights, right? The time of Reconstruction where we saw black people voting, black people being elected, black people running for office is after the end of Reconstruction and during the 1880s and 1890s coming to an end, because white supremacists in southern state governments are going to make Jim Crow laws, which were laws specifically designed to exclude black people from politics, to separate them from white societies, to restrict any rights that they may have gained during Reconstruction.
Right. And we see this kind of combated by Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. They fight Jim Crow in their own different ways. And there's a reading for this module that's the difference here. And so I'll start with Booker T. Washington. And he was a slave. He was born a slave. And of course, his autobiography, Up from Slavery, was a textbook for basically for slaves who wanted to better themselves. And his idea was, look, we're not going to be equal.
Right.
Get the idea of equality out of your mind. They're not going to allow it. I mean, it's sad. It was sad. I don't think he said it lightly. I think he said it sadly and with sorrow, but he knew that white elites in the South were never going to see black people as equals, and that the best thing black people could do was educate themselves, learn to read and write, learn to do mathematics, get a vocational education, and build your own wealth.
And it's easy to criticize Booker T. Washington on this. I think that's the wrong attitude because Booker T. Washington had a very, very, very intimate understanding of how race worked. He understood that extremely well.
Right. And his idea was we need to do everything we can do to build our own wealth, build a black middle class.
Right.
And once we show white elites that we can build this middle class and that there are black people all over the South who are, in industry, in all these vocations, they will have to accept us.
Right.
Because we'll have power.
Right.
Power through economics.
Right.
Now, W.E.B. Du Bois is a little bit different.
W.E.B. Du Bois is different. And one thing I want to highlight is, when we talk about Jim Crow, we talk about kind of the racial caste system in the South. One thing it's tempting to think is that it's tempting to wonder, well, were black Southerners resisting this in some way? Well, yes, right? It's not that black Southerners were just kind of sitting around letting this happen. They weren't doing that, right? They were resisting in different ways. Booker T. Washington is an example of that resistance, but W.E.B. Du Bois is another example of that. And where Booker T. Washington is going to preach kind of a toleration of Jim Crow, kind of saying, just be patient with it, got to deal with it for now. W.E.B. Du Bois is saying, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to deal with this for now. We should agitate, protest, demonstrate, pass, push for the passing of laws that protect civil rights. He is kind of demanding civil rights now, right? Not a patience for it.
They're very different because he was Booker T. Washington was born a slave. W.E.B. Du Bois was not a slave.
No.
Born after the Civil War. The first black PhD
from Harvard.
degree from Harvard University, and he believed in a core of black intellectuals who would lead the black community to the promised land, and the promised land being equality with whites.
Right.
And I think that was where he was a little more utopian than Washington. Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois was he was a globetrotter.
One of the most educated people,
right?
Maybe the most educated person living at that time.
Right. He lived in France. He lived in England. He gave speeches to academic academies and things like that. Booker T. Washington was a Southern man who understood the South. Yeah. And I think that is one of the biggest differences was that Du Bois understood the South from a library. Yeah. And you can learn a lot from books and the library. And it's not that he was uneducated on the subject, but there's no teacher-like experience. And Booker T. Washington was there all the time. And he knew that it didn't matter if you had 2 PhDs from Harvard. The white landowner in Mississippi was never going to see you as an equal. Right. It didn't matter how smart you were. It didn't matter. What mattered and what they couldn't deny was economic power.
And W.B. Du Bois is going to kind of respond to that and say, look, if you do not have guarantee of equal rights or some federal protection for your rights, it's not going to matter how much property you have. Right. He's speaking to Black Americans. He said, look, it doesn't matter what you got. They will take it
They'll
from
take
you.
it away.
And that's how W.B. Du Bois is going to respond to that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So 2 very different views, and you'll read about that a little bit this week. Next thing. So while all this is going on in the South after Reconstruction, we have at the beginning of Reconstruction and into this next era of American history, which will go until the late 1890s, we have what's called the Gilded Age. Okay. The Gilded Age is a transitional time in American history in the North, in the South, with the New South. But what does it mean? What's the Gilded Age? Why is it called the Gilded Age?
When we say gilded, of course, means something covered in gold, like a gold veneer. And
like a hunk of lead
right.
that's covered with gold.
Right. And in a lot of ways, this era looks like a lot of wealth. It is a lot of wealth and a lot of prosperity, but it's also a lot of prosperity for a certain group of folks. That's why it's gilded and not golden. right?
Right. It's not the golden age.
Is that veneer of gold. It might at first glance look nice and golden,
right.
but that ain't.
Underneath, there are
some gross
big
stuff.
social issues, political issues, and we're going to talk about that. So this era is really begun by these captains of industry. And the thing is, a lot of people see the Republican Party during the Civil War as being only focused on the war effort. But they had big domestic policies that they pushed through very quickly. 1862, you have the establishment of land-grant colleges, right, to train people to be engineers, right, which after those engineers are trained, many of them go into the Army, but after the war, they go into industry.
Sure.
So the North has this huge, already just growing class of well-educated, engineer-type folks living in the North who are ready to go into industry and succeed. The next thing is they have the Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act, but mainly the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to revolutionize the idea of building railways to haul freight rather than using just rivers, and canals, which was the big push in the early 1800s. The railroads in the North will put the economy into hyperdrive because the arduous journey of coal from a mine to a steel factory, a steel mill, becomes every day. It just becomes normal that you load coal onto a train, it goes to the steel mill, and then steel is produced. And that becomes the case for everything. So during this age, we have a few of these captains of industry or robber barons, robber barons being the negative connotation. If we don't like them at the time, we'll say, if we're talking about how poor they made conditions for workers, we'll call them robber barons. If we're talking about how rich they made the United States, we'll call them captains of industry. So it depends on where you're sitting at the time. But Cornelius Vanderbilt, famously the owner of Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina, the largest private residence in the world at the time. And
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yeah. And of course, not just the house, but also just all the land around it. And then probably the most famous, I think if you Wikipedia search the Gilded Age, it has his Breakers mansion from, I think it's in Connecticut. But the Breakers, another big mansion that he had owned by the Vanderbilt family. So he kind of is the beginning of it because he's into freight in the 1840s, 50s, and he's kind of the first captain of industry. Then we have the ones that we most associate with the Gilded Age, which are Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan. Andrew Carnegie, a steel baron, gets into coal. Rockefeller is in oil with Standard Oil, and J.D. Morgan is a banking magnate. So let's talk a little bit about what is a monopoly? What's a trust? Trust or monopoly in business, what's that?
So a trust and monopoly, a monopoly specifically is when a business is able to control or dominate almost an entire industry. Right. Where if you're gonna be involved in the industry in some way, you're gonna be dealing with like one company. That's more of a monopoly. A trust can be perhaps a group of businesses who work together to limit competition for their own benefit.
Right. So a trust is what they would have called it. We would now call it a cartel. Right. That's what we would. And of course, once again, the negative and positive connotation of these words. Trust. Great word. Trust is good.
Yeah.
Everybody wants trust.
I would like some.
But cartel, no. It's like, it's two different ways of looking at it. In a certain way, they had what was called horizontal and vertical integration of business. I'll say that again. Horizontal integration was where a company like Standard Oil would buy up other oil refineries, right? They would buy other oil refineries until they owned all the oil refineries. So horizontal integration was buying all the other businesses that did what you did. Vertical integration was really pioneered by Andrew Carnegie with steel, where he started out making steel and he said, well, I need coal for steel. Right. And I need a railroad to get the coal from the mine to the steel mill. So why don't I just buy the coal mine? Why don't I just buy the railroad? And now I own all of the things in the chain that lead me to steel. So that's vertical integration is when you want to make steel, you buy a railroad, you buy a coal mine, and now you have all the things, you buy iron ore mines. And now you own all the things that go into making steel, which means you're the only person who can make steel, because if no one else owns the coal mine and no one else owns the iron ore deposits and no one else can ship anything because you own the railroad, No one else is going to be making steel.
Yeah, which means you're going to have wealth that is almost unimaginable
Right.
at the time.
And then J.P. Morgan, famously J.P. Morgan bails out the United States government.
Yeah.
That's his big thing.
Just a flex.
Just
a small
just
thing.
flex it on the U.S. government
Yeah.
by, now we think of a bailout. That's the government bailing out a
Right.
business. Back then it was J.P. Morgan, a dude.
That's how powerful these people
Right.
are.
A man.
Yeah.
One man.
Yeah.
Meets with the U.S. government and says, I will give you this many $1 million in exchange for these favors.
That's
right?
extraordinary power.
And he effectively owns the government at that point.
Yep.
And later on in 1901, he will buy Carnegie Steel, and J.P. Morgan, which is the largest banking empire in the United States, will also become the largest owner of steel mills and railroads.
And everyone's seen commercials for Chase Bank,
Right.
J.P. Morgan Chase.
J.P. Morgan Chase, Chase Bank is,
Yeah, these things are not that long ago.
Right,
Some of
and-
them are still with us.
Standard Oil is broken up by antitrust law, which we'll get to in a second, but it becomes ExxonMobil.
Right.
So every time you pass Exxon or a Mobil gas station, that's John D. Rockefeller.
The power of these men doesn't just go away.
No.
The wealth that they accumulate doesn't just vanish upon their death. It kind of comes around in different forms.
Right. And so in an attempt to break up some of these monopolies, because they felt like they were causing problems for the government, they were causing problems for the working man, the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed by Congress in 1890, designed to limit the size of these businesses
Right.
and the scope of these businesses. And of course, there's an early Supreme Court case. It's called the E.C. Knight case, and there were other cases where they lost. The government just lost to the businesses, and there were, I think it was a sugar company that owned like 94% of the market, and the Supreme Court ruled that wasn't a monopoly, right? So the law didn't work really until it got its champion in Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
And we'll see that later in the Progressive Era,
Mhm.
but it took someone who was not just going to half-heartedly,
It took the will.
right, it took the will to say no
Yeah.
to those business leaders when they said, well, you could break us up, but you're going to lose a lot of money.
Right.
TR, he was willing to say,
Well,
come at me.
Right.
So that is kind of the economic side of the Gilded Age.
Yes.
Now, immigration and labor, huge immigration after the Civil War into
Yes.
northern cities and from Europe. And New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, all these eastern cities become inundated, just filled with these immigrants
Yes.
from Eastern Europe, Western Europe. They're
Yep.
coming from Germany, more Eastern European influence than during settlement.
Correct.
And during earlier waves of immigration mainly came from Germany, Scotland, and Ireland, and
Mhm.
England. This immigration is going to come from Germany, but also Austria, Hungary,
Italy.
Ukraine, Italy, Southern Europe. And these are going to be the people who are fit into they're the cogs in the machine. I mean, these are the people who are going to go into these cities, and they're going to work in these factories in horrendous conditions. And it's so amazing that we now think of it as horrendous conditions, right? And yes, they were horrendous conditions.
Mhm.
By any stretch of the imagination, they're
Yeah.
horrendous conditions.
Yeah.
But you read what they wrote back to their home country, like people who came from Hungary,
Mhm.
and they write back home and they say, it's like Christmas every day.
Right.
Like I can go and get lunch anywhere I want. I can just buy food and
Right.
and so in our modern day minds, it was horrendous. And there were things about it that were horrendous, like child labor
Mhm.
and poor working conditions. But we have to remember that they were coming from countries where starvation was not out of the question.
Right.
Like they were literally escaping from places where they were fighting to survive,
Yeah.
not to thrive, not to like have upward mobility
Right.
in society, but just to live.
Yeah.
And so for them, even though it was bad,
Mhm.
it was an improvement over what they experienced in their old country.
Sure.
And that is not, I don't think that's a political statement. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, you're trying to kind of downplay the evils of the monopolies and of the robber barons. No, they were bad people. I don't doubt that they were gonna, if you said, hey, we're gonna have to kill, some of these people might die, but we'll make a lot of money. I mean, yeah, that was considered normal, right? But you have to understand that for those people who were coming here, millions and millions and millions of people don't come across an ocean to come to a new country because it's worse.
Right.
Right. So as bad as it was, we can all pretty much agree it was better than living in Ukraine.
Right.
Right. Now on the West Coast, we get a lot of immigration from China, and In 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act because people just did not want any more Chinese workers in California.
Right.
So,
well, and when we see, we were just talking about Jim Crow. We're talking about this very kind of white supremacist idea.
Right.
White supremacist ideas did not just affect Black Americans; they're also going to affect immigrants, right? Because again, as we were talking about, the vision of many white Americans, sort of a white man's government, a white man's country. Well, it's going to affect immigrants as well. So we see things like the Chinese Exclusion Act as another kind of incarnation of the white supremacist thinking that was everywhere at this time.
And then later on in the 1890s, we'll get acts that limit immigration from every country to 10% of the current population of the United States. So they would take the census and they would say, well, there's 8 million Italians in the United States, which means you can only bring in 10% of that number every year.
Right.
So, and then people were turned away.
Sure.
And that was for all nationalities, but not Chinese. Chinese immigration was stopped.
Yeah.
Could not come in to China. And one of the things that they used as like a crutch to do this was they said, well, they're not loyal to America. They weren't citizens, by the way. Chinese people were not citizens because they still pledged loyalty to the Emperor of China. That was, that was the argument used by the U.S. government.
Yes,
they were not loyal to the United States, therefore they couldn't be citizens. And we talk about what's it mean to be white, right? And now I think that, at the time, Irish people weren't white.
No, right.
Italians weren't. Being an Italian was not. That didn't confer on you the same rights and privileges as being white Anglo-Saxon American.
Anglo-Saxon is kind of key there.
And Chinese was no different. If you were Chinese, you weren't white.
No.
You were on the same level to most people as a freedman, as a freed slave.
White was a color, but it was also an ancestry.
Right. It was exactly.
Yeah.
So all of these problems within immigration and harsh treatment of immigrants and the harsh treatment of laborers under these Gilded Age robber barons, captains of industry leads to labor unrest. And we see this in the form of the 1877 railroad strike, where railroads just come to a halt. And for the first time ever, we see that labor has power.
Right.
That not just the captains of industry have power, but the laborers also have power because they can bring everything to a halt.
Yep.
The Pullman rail car strike in 1894 and the Haymarket Square riot are other examples where people went on strike. Now, back then, it wasn't uncommon that, Pullman, they had their own police force.
Yeah.
They had their own, basically, they were jackbooted thugs. But they used like the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency was used to come in and effectively put down these what were considered rebellions. Right. And the government turned a blind eye.
100%.
They went in, the Pinkertons went in at Pullman, and they were there at the Haymarket Square as well. And they basically just killed people. Yeah. They were empowered to kill people if they felt like they were taking the strike in the wrong direction, right? And they were empowered to kill people to scare people away from striking.
Yep. And a lot of elites in the federal government, a lot of robber baron elites saw labor union activity kind of pushes for Black civil rights as a similar coin, right? Kind of lower classes asserting themselves in some ways. And of course, the elites at the time could not abide that. Right.
And so we get the American Federation of Labor, which is now called the AFL-CIO.
Yep.
And it's formed in 1886 by Samuel Gompers. And then the American Railway Union is founded by Eugene Debs in 1893. And these unions will really come to dominate American labor. And we see this connection between this fight between labor and management for the rest of American history now. And we still see it today. So it begins in the Gilded Age.
And labor unions, I have to point this out, there was oftentimes with labor unions at this time, there was a racial element too, right? Where sometimes these labor unions were sort of like, the power of white labor, right? Like not a lot of them thought of immigrants
of labor,
right? The knights of labor. Thought of immigrants as like pushing down wages as the enemy too.
Right.
So my point here is that during this era, you cannot get away from the racial question. It's everywhere.
Right, and it not just the Black racial question, but also immigrant racial questions.
Very true.
So, politics of the Gilded Age. Just to finish up, this has been famously called by one historian the era of good stealing, right? Which was kind of taken from the era of the Monroe presidency in the federal era in the early 1800s, where there were no political parties. Everyone agreed.
Oh, nice.
Right. Everyone agreed. And they had the era of good feelings. Well, this was the era of good stealings, where everyone agreed that taking money from taxpayers and putting it in their pockets was a good idea.
Yeah.
And it was also called the Great Barbecue, because it was like business and the government just kind of got together and, ate some burgers and had some drinks and split up all the money in the country.
The elites are having a great time.
It was a great time to be an elite.
Yeah.
So the first big scandal is the Credit Mobilier scandal, which was, it's a little complicated, but basically Congress was paying this company, Credit Mobilier, to build railroads. Mm-hmm. Well, the general public didn't know that the company that was building the railroad was also owned by the railroad, and that they were the only ones bidding on the jobs. So there was no actual open bidding. Whatever they bid, that's what they got paid. And sometimes it was, by the end of the scandal, it was 7, 8, 10 times more than what it actually cost.
Right.
And what they were doing was they were taking the money and they were giving a lot of the money back to congressmen in kickbacks to keep them voting in the ways that they wanted them to. And this scandal just shakes Congress to the core, and people really we think about Nixon and people losing faith in American government because of Richard Nixon. If this happened today, it would be front page all the time for months, because literally congressmen were taking bribes from railroad companies to vote in a certain way, which, you could argue that we just do that legally now, but back then it really struck people. It really made them wary of Congress. And the next thing would be the whiskey ring. So Ulysses S. Grant was able to avoid the Credit Mobilier scandal because that was done by Congress, and he wasn't involved. But the whiskey ring was done by the Secretary of the Treasury and the Treasury Department, and also a lot of the bankers and people that advised him. Basically, what was happening was whiskey companies, whiskey producers were paying the tax assessors to not count. They'd count like every fourth barrel of whiskey.
Very
so there would be 20 barrels of whiskey, and they'd say there was 10. And it got to the point where, it started out and they would say we've got 100, but you can only just count 80, right, to save on taxes.
Right.
And we'll take some of that money that we save in taxes and we'll give it to you as a bribe. Well, it got to the point where it was just like they were underestimating by like 90%. Like for every 20 barrels, they were counting 2. Yeah. And so this blows up in Grant's face. Grant says that he didn't know anything about it, but of course he definitely did. He knew what was going on, and he just kind of had a hands-off approach to it. He knew there was corruption, but now the presidency and Congress are tainted. Yeah. And these political scandals are not helped by the emergence of political machines, where basically the Democratic Party especially goes into cities where immigrants have just arrived, and they effectively deputize them into a political way of thinking, and they coerce them effectively into basically gangs that are affiliated with that political party.
Right. In a big way, it's kind of taking advantage of those aspirations that we talk about immigrants had, right? They're coming to the United States for a better life. And in a lot of ways, these political machines are looking to kind of take that and use it for their own benefit and kind of take advantage of it.
Right. And so the most famous one is definitely the Tammany Hall, run by Boss Tweed, a huge political machine for the Democrats, and they own city politics. Major cities in the North, just like before the Civil War, actually, they dominated city politics in the North before the Civil War in New York and Boston. Democrats dominated in areas that were covered in the rural areas by Whigs and then Republicans. And then after Reconstruction, Democrats began again not only to dominate in what's known as the Solid South, but also in those urban areas. So you would go to a city like New York, and everywhere around is dominated by Republicans. But inside the city, everyone's voting Democrat. And if you do vote Republican, your vote gets quickly taken out of the ballot box and shredded.
Very convenient.
Right. And the Democrats were winning every election in those cities. They were not going to lose. They were fixing the elections effectively.
Yes, they were.
And so the Gilded Age, an era of great prosperity for many people, an era of inspiration and aspiration for immigrants, for the newly freed slaves in the South, an era of hope for a lot of people. But at the core of it, we still have these basic issues of, how we treat immigrants, how we
Yes.
treat the freed slave population. What about equality? Like what equality, because we throw it out the window.
Yeah.
And
No, I mean, that is true. It is a time for, as you said, prosperity for some, but a time of deep inequality, not just on class lines, but also on racial lines.
Right.
Again, like you mentioned, racial, when we say both Black Americans and immigrant Americans.
right. And so the next era will be the progressive era, where
Mhm.
we'll see an outpouring of people wanting to change some of these things,
Right.
wanting to change, especially in the area of workers' rights,
Mhm.
in the area of equality for immigrants,
Sure.
and not just equality politically, but human rights. Like,
Right.
what's it mean that we're taking these people and we're putting them in these factories and they're dying and
Yeah.
being maimed?
Yeah.
We need to do something about that. This kind of growth. And I think the big thing is we see in the progressive era that these progressive policies are taken up by mainstream political parties.
Yes.
That there were always these offhand political parties that were formed, like the temperance movement,
Sure.
or the women's rights
Mhm.
movement, but they were never accepted by mainstream political parties like the Democratic or the Republican Party. And you'll see presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, who was more conservative, and then he will champion progressive policies, even though he is considered a conservative.
Right.
And then Woodrow Wilson, the arch progressive, who will bring into fruition all of these ideas, and not only the ideas, but they'll be put into the Constitution.
Right.
Many of them will. And so that'll be our next episode. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned a ton, and I hope you are better able to interact with the resources that you've been given. We will see you very soon.
Adios.